So this is almost 23 hours GMT, which is midnight in the UK. So the 23 hours GMT, 2300 hours GMT on Tuesday, the 8th of September 2020. We'll be talking about 8th of September in 1993 in Commercial Road again, when a group of racists nearly killed a Bangladeshi young person, a teenager, and that caused me to do campaign for justice for him and for justice against the racists that took up more than the following 2 years. And in those 2 years, I also was left with no option but to campaign for justice for the 11-year-old child, Nasima Begum, who was killed due to negligence by London ambulance in the Royal London Hospital. Okay, so, but this one is starting with a rereading of the rebel poet Qazi Nazrul Islam. And as I access it on the internet, this is in the Bangla as it is available on the internet, which means that I cannot check the accuracy of the script because it's online and the original print is not available online. But it is about the hungry of the world, the prisoners of hunger. That is my translation of the poem Onashon Bondi. And I called it Prisoners of Hunger. Arise, O prisoners of hunger. Jago onashon bondi otore joto জগতের লাঞ্ছিত ভাগ্য হতো যত অত্যাচারে আজি বজ্রহানি হাকে নিপীড়িত জনমন মথিত বাণী নবজনমলবী অভিনব ধরণী ওরে ওই আগত আদি শৃঙ্খল সনাতন শাস্ত্র আচার মূল সর্বনাশের এরে ভাঙিব এবার বেদি দৈত্যকারা আয় সর্বহারা কেহ রহিবে না আর পর পদানত. So this is the I have read some by correcting in the reading some of the typing errors in there, like what's said Adi Srinkol Shanaton Shastro Achai. It's not Achai, it is Achar because it rhymes with the following line, which is Mul Shorbonasher Ere Bhangibo Ebar. So Ebar is preceded by Achar in the previous line. This is one of the poems, one of the number of poems, I cannot give the count, that I have been translating. When I say I have been, it means that I have not been satisfied that my particular translations met the standards that I aim to reach. The other thing about my translation from these poems, not just of the rebel poet Qazi Nazrul Islam, but other poets, other people who have written kind of poems and attempted to imitate him. There has been one thing that I have noticed, that while translating, I have to inject a kind of clarity and a kind of rigor and a kind of characteristics that I thought and the context warranted should be there. But in the originals, there weren't those particular features. Not so much in Nazrul's, but in other poems. But even in Nazrul wrote to a large extent appealing to the emotions of people around many of the images that he invoked. And one of the emotions was very much empirical, personal, based on his experience. For example, নবনবীন জীবন হবে উত্থিতর, শুন অত্যাচারী, শুন রে সঞ্চয়ী, ছিনু সর্বহারা হব সর্বজয়ী। ওরে সর্বশেষের এই সংগ্রাম মাঝ নিজ নিজ অধিকার জুড়ে দাঁড়া সবে আজ, এই জনগণ অন্তর সংহতিরে হবে নিখিল মানব জাতি সমুদ্যত। Now, আদি শৃঙ্খল সনাতন শাস্ত্র আচার মূল সর্বনাশের এরে ভাঙিব এবার. That is a reference to much of his own experience, and that includes a very subtle kind of reference to his being imprisoned, put in prison by the British for telling the truth and for demanding justice. So again, Jaga Onashan Bondi Utorejata, arise, O prisoners of hunger. So that call is the theme, or is in the theme, or is part of the theme that I created in English. And it is unique because none of the translators, including this person who has been overhyped as the professor of English, Munir Chaudhry at the University of Dhaka, none of the translations come anywhere near the standard of the poetry of Nazrul. And most certainly they don't come near what I have been trying to create. All these poems typified by Munir Chaudhry are timid, and they are written in a surrogate supplicatory English. Their mindset is framed by the Macaulayite program, Thomas Babington Macaulay. And so they're not the words or phrases or the images or imageries of a rebel poet. And that is the difference. So I have been engaged in trying to translate them, interpret them, introduce them to the people who read English or who are English language speakers or readers as the rebel poetry would warrant and demand, and as the contents would demand. So I said, arise, O prisoners of hunger. That is not what the other people have been translating, including Munir Chaudhry. And so the same thing applies to my poem, or my Englished Nazrul, Englished, Englished, the verb, Englished, that is turned into English as a verb by me. My English Nazrul is the only rebel Nazrul. The other versions of Nazrul's translation, or translations of Nazrul into English, are not rebel English. They are very submissive English. And it is a completely different world from what Nazrul was doing in his thinking. What it says here, Joto oittachare aji bojrohani hake nipidito Janamon Motitobani. This is wrongly typed here, Ripirito Janamon Motitobani. He's talking about the whole world, and he's writing around the time of the Soviet Revolution. Of course, that revolution completely was in tatters, and it never came to fruition in terms of delivering the fruits of revolution. But Nazrul was not aware of the decay and the degeneration that were to follow. He was celebrating the international awareness of this liberation and freedom from all the oppression of empire, of capitalism, and of racism. So he said to the whole world, he was acting as the courier of the message, the messenger from the universal revolution that was taking place about 100 years ago now, exactly. 1918, 1917, 1920, whatever. That whole decade, it went on for all of that decade, the awareness. So he said, Jago onoshon bondi otore joto jogoter lanchito bhagyahoto. Lanchito. Lanchito is the most undignified state, to be harassed, to be kicked around, to be insulted, to be degraded. So all of the people degraded, violated, denied across the world arise. All the people of hunger, in hunger. So prisoners of hunger. 100 years ago, prisoners of hunger. And today, 100 years later, prisoners of hunger are trying to escape prisons of hunger and famine and starvation. So what has changed 100 years? So it's absolutely today's poem. Arise, O prisoners of hunger. Today, Tuesday, the 7th of, Tuesday the 8th of September, there was a news item released by the United Nations that a group of people who had been on the sea, in the sea on the way to Indonesia, had just landed, and that about 20 of the people in the vessel had died, or in the journey had died. And one of the persons was from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Now the question is, all these people who have been given, quote, refuge in Bangladesh, especially in Cox's Bazar, why would one of them want to leave Cox's Bazar? So that raises the question that the people who have been in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, in and around Cox's Bazar, are not being allowed to feel free and feel safe and feel confident. So that's why that person must have felt that. So the United Nations, the whole day, the whole week, has been tweeting and posting stuff on the social media, talking about the wonderful work that the volunteers, UN volunteers do, and the various UN agencies do, including the UN Human Rights Commission and UNICEF, the Children's Agency for Children's Rights and Welfare, and the UNESCO, which is the cultural one that has been now wrongly kind of boasting that an Iraqi man who was a truck driver has now turned into recreating some of the old statues and artifacts and the sculptures of Iraq. And in passing, the United Nations release says that many of these sculptures and statues were destroyed during the conflict. How dishonest of the United Nations scripters. It was not conflict. It was a mass destruction of almost all the ancient and precious structures and statues in Iraq by the USA-led assault on Iraq. Now, Iraq has been for 11 centuries, 12 centuries, that long, the center of so much educational, cultural, intellectual, and spiritual work. And the United Nations completely forgets the destruction of all of that, including the universities in Iraq, including the University of Basra and the libraries. The libraries in Iraq were the first organized one in the known recorded times. We don't know what the equivalents were 5,000 years ago or even before that. So all we know is what we have been able to materially, physically kind of access during the last few thousand years. And Iraq has been the center of the endeavors that excelled the rest of the world, whatever they were doing, including China. Now, the United Nations is being disingenuous, and it should withdraw that line, conflicts, and it should replace that by inserting a summary of the truth, which is that wars waged by warmongers destroyed Iraq's culture, libraries, education centers, and much of these structures that they say that this particular former truck driver, a lorry driver, is now engaged in recreating and reconstructing. So we'll be connecting what the United Nations is doing in rewriting history of Iraq by suppressing the truth about what the USA did under the two Bushes, and also with the collusion of Tony Blair. These people have been waging war against culture, education, civilization, and they are being allowed to get away. In fact, they are being allowed to remain forgotten where it comes to the destruction they have caused. When the British media, including the BBC, boasted of George W. Bush attack on Iraq the first time, in the big attack on Baghdad, and John Simpson was apparently a witness to what was happening. These people never uttered a single word about the darkness, the forces of darkness that the warmongers represented. And since the attacks, they haven't, even now, after nearly 20 years later, or nearly 2 decades later, they have not recounted, they have not given the list of the destruction caused that amounted to destroying thousands of years, equivalent of very significant intellectual, philosophical, cultural, ideological, ethical, aesthetic work. And that work was at a higher level on every account, on every criteria, than anything else that existed anywhere else in the world, including the UK, the USA, the wherever else, the Russia, China. So what can justify such violation and violence? This is hatred, darkness and hatred and racism and crusade. So those apologists of the crusade must think what they did and what they are doing still now, because they are maintaining the same narrative, disguised but the same narrative. And when Amber Rudd's daughter was given a spot on the Times, and she wrote a kind of ignorant piece about the stolen artifacts that Britain had to kind of review the ownership or control of. She left out all the real facts and the evidence. So therefore, it wasn't really a genuine regard for the statues, the cultural, historic, material things, nor for the contents of the libraries that George W. Bush and Tony Blair destroyed. Now, just to put in context, if the meaning of libraries, the importance of libraries is not understood readily, I just say again that it is summarized, the meaning of libraries is summarized, not fully detailed, but summarized in a brilliant essay written by Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. It's called Library. মহাসমুদ্রের শতবৎসরের কল্লোল কেহ যদি এমন করিয়া বাঁধিয়া রাখিতে পারিত. Now he's comparing a library with Mahasamudra, mega sea, big sea, that 100 years of ripples of the big ocean, if anyone could put those ripples together in a package, then that would begin to match a library. So multiply that 1,000 times or more to begin to assess the value and the worth and the importance of the libraries that the American warmongers destroyed in Iraq. So that's where I would leave that question as part of the question to be answered. So back to Prisoners of Hunger by the poet, the rebel poet Kazi Nazrul Islam. He is promising and he's inviting the Shorbahara, the have-nots, those who have nothing. He's saying nobody will remain the servant or obeyer of anyone else. And a new life and a new order will be created, will be raised on new foundations of freedom. কেহ রহিবে না আর পর পদানত, নবভিত্তি পরে নবনবীন জীবন হবে উত্থিতরে, শুন অত্যাচারী, শুন রে সঞ্চয়ী. So he's saying that, listen, you oppressor, listen, you saber. He's talking about the saber, meaning the hedge funders and other big billionaire criminals that we know now. So he's saying to them, Chinu Sarvahara Hobo Sarbojoyi, that we have been the victims of your robbery and theft and looting. We have been have-nots, we have had nothing, and we shall have everything back. We shall conquer everything. Chinu Sarvahara Hobo Sarbojoyi. Sarbojoyi means all winning, all the rights winning, not repeating the billionaire crooks and criminals, but what belongs to each one of us. The many, before the many, 100 years before the many were chanted by Jeremy Corbyn, the many were actually given life to in these lines by the rebel poet Kazi Nazrul Islam, thousands of miles away from the center of the empire. But Corbyn or his ilk never ever understand these huge resources, huge reserve of resources that are unmatched and unmatchable by anything ever available in these islands. Even the mysterious kind of overdone mythologizing by Dan Snow and others of his ilk about the relics on these islands. Even when they over-hypothesize, over-mythologize those, the Stonehenge and other stones, they don't match the very clear tradition, the very clear message of learning, scholarship, liberation, understanding. And as I said, 2 days ago, this central instrument of computer technology today being algorithm. Now the algorithm is named after an Arab person, Persian person, Arab person, very much in the vicinity of Iraq that George W. Bush and his father and Tony Blair destroyed. Al-Khwarizmi, or Al-Khwarizmi. There's some Arabic name distorted by the British to make it completely unrecognizable as Arabic. So these mathematical geniuses were contributing to the human knowledge and abilities from that part of the world. And so that is just a sample. And Nazrul is saying, this is the last war. When you're saying about the defeating the sabers and the big billionaire crooks, he's saying this is the last war against them because they have been starving us. They have been starving us. They have been robbing us of food and lives and livelihoods. And he's calling on all the prisoners of hunger to come and take their respective place on the line. Nij nij odhikar jude dara shobe aaj. He's saying that take your rightful position for your rights. Ei jonogon ontor সংহতিরে, this international people's solidarity. This people's international solidarity will symbolize and raise to the highest level the humanity, the status of humanity, a free, liberated humanity. So I read that again, the whole thing. Jago onashan bandi utore joto, জগতের লাঞ্ছিত ভাগ্য হতো, যত অত্যাচারে আজি বজ্রহানি হাকে নিপীড়িত জনমন মথিত বাণী, নবজনম লবি অভিনব ধরণী ওরে ওই আগত. There comes the new world order, অভিনব ধরণী, unprecedented world, planet, order on the world and planet. So I say that he is including also the state of the planet. He's talking about Obhinava Dharani. He's not talking about population, he's talking about Dharani, the planet. So the environmentalist, rebel poet, is also the anti-poverty, anti-hunger, freedom poet. Jago onashon bandi utore joto, জগতের লাঞ্ছিত ভাগ্য হতো, যত অত্যাচারে আজি বজ্রহানি হাকে নিপীড়িত জনমন মথিত বাণী. Bajrahani is the lightning and thunder. That all the oppressors and oppressions would be hit with lightning and thunder. That's what he's saying. So the imagery is absolutely brilliant and attuned to the needs felt by the prisoners of hunger and oppression. নবনবীন জীবন হবে উত্থিতরে, শুন অত্যাচারী, শূন্য সঞ্চয়ী, ছিনু সর্বহারা, হব সর্বজয়ী। ওরে সর্বশেষের এই সংগ্রাম মাঝ, নিজ নিজ অধিকার জুড়ে দাঁড়া সবে আজ। এই জনগণ অন্তর সংহতিরে, হবে নিখিল মানব জাতি সমুদ্রত। দ্য ইউনিভার্সাল হিউম্যানিটি, the humanity of the world would be raised across the world in freedom, freedom from hunger, oppression, denial, everywhere. Jago অনশন বন্দে উঠরে যত, arise all prisoners of hunger. So that is the poem, typical of the literally hundreds that Nazrul wrote in the mode of rebellion. And each one of the poems, Nazrul's poems, is totally unique. There is no like or likeness in the work of any other poet, even writing in the same language as he did, the Bengali language or Bangla language. And as I said a few times, one of his closest friends or acquaintances for a period, because of his illness and other difficulties caused by his active engagement against the imperialism and his being imprisoned, Nazrul's life was totally unsettled in the physical sense. But for a significant amount of time, that is quality time that he had available, he had friends like Sufi Zulfikar Haidar, who I spoke to only one occasion in January 1917, Dhaka. On the bank of the river Buriganga, after we had returned from a trip delivering relief to the victims of flood in that area on that day. And Sufi Zulfikar Haidar said to me, in what is now absolutely a gem of a recollection, that Nazrul was very generous, and as I compared him with Mujib in that respect, and he didn't kind of disown his supporters or his acquaintances. Sheikh Mujib didn't disown his supporters and acquaintances, despite the fact that he got numerous reports that they were doing bad things and they were up to no good. He kept being loyal to them. So Nazrul was, long before Sheikh Mujib's, Nazrul was very, very kind to his acquaintances and very generous. And instead of reciprocating his kindness, they were very, very bitchy against him and they were plotting. And they didn't have anything really to plot for except to be spiteful. Now, nobody knows who they were. Well, somebody could find a list of them. And Sufi Zulfikar, if he had time to speak to me longer, he would have given me the list, which he was beginning to do. And we had planned to meet. And I had planned to interview him on the record and extensively. But events, as Macmillan said, events came in and we never met again. And Sufi Zulfikar said that Nazrul was the target of serial spite and jealousy by people around him. I mean, people who came, and any number of people visited him and wanted to make friends with him and all the rest of it, because of the name, because of the kind of impact he had. Only if they knew just how profound his work was and how profoundly important his time was, probably they would have desisted from being so jealous. and being so spiteful and poisonous. Despite all of that, we are reading Nazrul today, and I hope that he will be read for a very long time, for eternity, because it is about the oppressed, about the victims of injustice. There can be no bigger mission than to liberate the victims of injustice, to dish out justice, and to share justice among the victims of injustice. It is next to the work of a prophet. That is what Nazrul did, and that is what one of his main poetic idols or poetic kind of mentors and inspirations did. It's Rumi, but Rumi inspired others, including Iqbal. And so therefore, these are work of saints. This is not just a rebel poem, but it's a work of a saint. It's like a prayer. It is inspiring people to feel the inherent justice promised to the victims of wrongful attacks promised by God in all the scriptures and all the books and all the traditions. That's what is promised. So it's like heaven on earth, a glimpse of heaven on earth. That's what Nazrul is approaching. It's hell on earth under the regimes of those who take away your food, your house, your home. And Nazrul is saying that an end to that is coming. নিজ নিজ অধিকার জুড়ে দাঁড়া সবে আজ এই জনগণ অন্তর সংহতিরে নবে হবে নিখিল মানব জাতি সমুদ্যত. So this is the want, this is the absence of justice, the absence of solidarity, absence of freedom that is imperiling the world everywhere, as it did then and is it doing now. So we shall be continuing with Nazrul and including some others in the narrative. For example, so this is the one that he says in the rebel poem. মহাবিদ্রোহী আমি রণক্লান্ত, না, মহাবিদ্রোহী রণক্লান্ত আমি সেই দিন হব শান্ত, যবে উৎপীড়িতের ক্রন্দন রোল আকাশে বাতাসে ধ্বনিবে না, অত্যাচারের খড়গ কৃপান ভীম রণভূমে রণিবে না, বিদ্রোহী রণক্লান্ত আমি সেই দিন হব শান্ত. Now this is the kind of poetry that doesn't read like a human being has written it. It reads like some kind of additional inspiration was there, because ordinary so-called secular poetry is written in a very secular, materialistic, selfish sense, very petty, very limited horizon. But Nazrul's horizon is beyond the limited, unlimited, international, always. And so, Mahabidruhi, mega rebel. This is not some kind of petty revolt, but it's a rebel of the biggest, most comprehensive size that matches the size of the oppression and the oppressor. And those people who are spiteful against Nazrul were actually aiding and abetting the already overwhelming attacks that were underway against Nazrul and other people who were not poets, but who were intellectually thinking along the same lines of opposing the empire. And that is the message. Today, the empire has got different form, but the empire, the narrative, the purpose of the empire to keep the people down continues unabated. And in the British media, the newspapers, there is absolutely no evidence that they have heard of this world inhabited intellectually by the likes of Qazi Nazrul Islam. Anyone reading the Fleet Street papers would think anyone that is from the real world, or the world of Africa and Asia, and the world ravaged by famine and hunger and genocide today, would think that Britain was a kind of reading the newspapers and the media, that Britain was a Lilliput because they were not relating to the reality. They were not grasping the reality, the size of the reality, the magnitude of the reality. So in the next edition, whenever I get to do it, of the diagnosis of the media, I shall be looking at the Lilliput, England. And I shall be doing that as part of the update on the poetry of Nazrul Islam. This is the kind of thing that we have to be educated by, enlightened by, and liberate the world by, and the societies by. What that is doing in the darkness that we are heading, we are being, or the society is being pushed into by the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail. This darkness engulfing this country, and millions, tens of millions of British people are being lied to and being lied about. So here is the I will not talk about Bulbul because Bulbul is the name of his child who died. And I think that Nazrul was heartbroken more by the loss of his son, Bulbul, than by any other singular loss. And in my view, much of Nazrul's power against injustice can be linked to his outrage and loss felt at the loss of his son. But looked at it from any angle, Nazrul created such a collection of universally definable beauty of human feeling and thinking, universally definable, that it is an offense not to share his writings and his message with the wider world. That is what I have been engaged in for a long time. So why do I say I have been engaged in for a long time? Why do I say that? Because my engagement has been interrupted almost on a daily basis. And I'll give one example of the interruption. In New Road, London E1 1HE, I was subjected to or treated to the ultimate test of resilience over any number of time, over many years. This is how it went. The test was to test my patience and to provoke me into expression of physical outrage or aggression, which I resisted throughout. Never once in all those years did I give vent to what I was feeling. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the role of the Tower Hamlets Council, about the business rate that they charged for the business space, business premises. So one of the floors was apparently listed as a business premise, the basement in New Road. So a member of my family completely unwisely and foolishly, and in terms of the impact it has had on the work that I have been doing, stupidly, monumentally stupidly, lied regularly. And they lied by saying that the council would come to visit the premises the next day. Now, imagine the premises were the space I used to store large volumes, not all of the volumes, the large volumes of newspapers, magazines, and equipment, typing equipments that at that time were pre what we are using these days, devices. So they were bulkier. So I would be told late at night, the previous night, that the following day the council are going to visit. And contained in that message was the threat that if the council visited and found the place used to store things rather than the space being totally empty and void, then they would be charging the business rate, whatever the amount was. And the person who would give me the message would claim to be the person who would be lumbered with the bill unnecessarily due to the fact that I had stored all these items. Now, these items, like the libraries in Iraq and the British Library, let's say. So this person would treat them as totally rubbish, as total rubbish that they could be disposed of. Now, I'll tell you what their purpose was in giving me the message. So what I would do then, from 11 o'clock onwards in the evening until early in the morning, I would physically carry all the newspapers and magazines away from the basement and put them in the backyard. Now, this I did, I don't know how many times. I did that over, let's say, anything between 20 to 22 years, whatever the number of years. And I did not do that. I didn't get any help because at that time I couldn't get any help, anyone giving me a hand. And the person who was giving me that notice was doing that as a deliberate pressure on me to vacate the whole address. So the whole world outside thought that I was securely staying at New Road, but I wasn't. Because motivating this person was the connection with the money. They thought that they thought wrongly, but they thought that they were being deprived of significant monetary income by my occupying the space for doing campaigning work, writing, and political organization for the defense of the community. So about 22 years, I was treated to this kind of absolute physical harassment. And nobody knew. This is the first time I'm putting this on the record and in public. I was given the maximum human provocation, and I never allowed myself to be provoked for various reasons. One of the most practical was the effect any physical provocation and retaliation would have on other close members of the family. So I was not just being tested personally, but I was being used as a possible kind of explosion to hit other members of the family. So that is the secret to the theory of the campaign defending the community actually hid so many other vicissitudes and so many other little known facts that constitute internal intra community kind of violations, which is linked to what I said about the violations against children in the families in the Bangladeshi community. That is a symbolic statement. It could include other communities, but this is Bangladeshi community, Muslim people being cruel to other members of the family. Cruel to the point of nihilistic, monumental nihilism and stupidity, because they are negative beyond description. And no ordinary human tenacity and resilience, no ordinary human tenacity or resilience can exist in the face of this kind of provocation and violence and violations that are perpetrated by persons being motivated to gain money, which is completely futile, because the repeated provocation, and this was really putting me under severe test, that didn't get any money from any of these sources, because the council never came for a start, and there was no levying of extra charges. That was a lie repeatedly perpetrated and tested and tried against me, and not just against me, against the idea of defending the community, against the idea of opposing racism, against the idea of thinking internationally, thinking for liberation of the whole community and society. So when I say that migrants' rights are violated, I of course say that in the context of the migrants that were crossing the English Channel or the French Channel. But I say that on a general level. I do not include the consideration of settled so-called families of people, migrant families. So I say that by knowingly and intentionally avoiding any reference to the internal dynamics that take place among people who are migrants and as if trying to exist as families. Migration, this is one of the reasons I oppose migration as a solution to economic problems. That is one of the strongest reasons why I did that broadcast. in January 1992 on Channel 4 slot, asking for John Major and other Western leaders to actually engage in solving the economic and humanitarian problems at home in the originating countries. Because most of the lives of the migrants are ruined, if not destroyed, by migration. One way or the other, the detriment, the loss that is incurred by the people doing the migration as a solution is incalculable. So when I sent those people in the early 1960s under the employment voucher scheme from Sylhet in then East Pakistan, I didn't do that as a permanent solution to the overwhelming problems that beset each of their families. I did that as a one-off, singular, economic, short-term kind of answer, on the assumption that they would then have enough intelligence and sense to spend a few years abroad and then return and build their communities, their families. And that is what I have been engaged in, working out all this time. When I did that broadcast in January 1992, I was in the middle of battle against the Royal London Hospital and other attacks from the institutions and agencies. And what I'm saying here is absolutely, that is why it is exclusive, world exclusive diagnosis, and all rights are mine. I'm saying it, but I'm actually saying based on years of ongoing dynamic thoughts and engagements. So the migrants or the migration is not a solution to the people economically, socially, and most certainly not emotionally. The lives of the people who are migrants or immigrants are completely treated as belonging to the third or fourth lower tier. This is why the majority of the people from the subcontinent or from the African kind of backgrounds, especially from the Caribbean kind of route, Africans through the Caribbeans, are to be found in small areas where they congregate and they concentrate. So in Tower Hamlets, in Brick Lane is the front line for a reason. Because in the Brick Lane, in the vicinity of Brick Lane area, the Bangladeshis, or the people who are known as Bangladeshis now, 100 years ago, they started to settle in and around Brick Lane as they arrived here through the ships and things. And the reason why they wanted to live in one small area or next to one another is simple. There is intolerable racism. So there is no way that basic freedom, civic freedom, can be experienced by people from Africa or Asia living in any part of Britain, except when they choose to live next to one another. That is the key. That is the key. It's racism, not the choice by people to live in one area, and most certainly not any intention to form a ghetto or be part of a ghetto, which is a derogatory term when used in this context. So the Labour Party, which has been in process for more than 100 years now, has failed to address any of this. And the Labour Party is the nearest thing that Nazrul would call his party or the party to implement his plan or answer his call. Jago onashon bandi utore joto jagoter lanchito bhagya. The degraded and the luckless people, prisoners of hunger, arise. The Labour Party has not itself arisen, let alone raise the other people. So all these complex issues and complexities that I'm putting together in this diagnostic analysis and update, they're not to be found anywhere. This is something that is unique to my battles against all the criminality and lies and oppression and racism and internal kind of surrender to greed and corruption that beset most families and most so-called family units or relations in this country, among people from Bangladesh. And I'm absolutely certain by extrapolation, people from India and people from Pakistan, but I am empirically most familiar with Bangladeshis by definition. And the people who have been making subsidiary careers as helpers of the Bangladeshis or helpers of the victims of racism, but themselves they are white people or mentally whitened, those people have been operating in a vacuum, mental vacuum, emotional vacuum, intellectual vacuum, and spiritual vacuum. These people have been aiding and abetting the perpetrators, and they have been aggravating the extent of racism and denial. And to them, the Bangladeshi families or the Muslim families or Pakistani families or Indian families, but Indians are, for a number of reasons, differently constituted in interrelations. But the Bangladeshis are seen as somehow coming from a background that is not of this world. Now, that could not be more wrong and untrue. I named this project East End News that I was part of in 1980-81, when the then cabal in power in the left faction of the National Union of Journalists, they had a falling out with the right faction for some reason. And one of the cabal leaders was Jacob Eccleston, Jake Eccleston. So he, along with a number of others, especially the Socialist Workers member, Adrian White, they confected the idea of setting up a paper called the Eastern News, which they would use as a vehicle to oppose the opponents inside the National Union of Journalists. So when I joined out of sheer universal solidarity with the stated aims of that cabal, that the aims were not cabalists, but they were universally praised. So when I joined them, I found them to be as racist, as backward, as corrupt, as criminal, as the card-carrying member of the racist party or organization outside was. And that included a sinister female called Zelda Curtis of the Communist Party. And these people successfully messed up the project of the Eastern News. So when I condemn the right and the racists and the fascists, I do so with the fullest possible awareness of the corruption and criminality being done by the racist opponents, so-called, the anti-racist so-called, and the so-called trade unionists, the so-called socialists, and even by the so-called victims of racism, so many members of the community that I kind of culturally, broadly speaking, belong to or am supposed to be part of. So this is absolutely original diagnostic world exclusive revelation sharing with the only purpose I'm sharing this is to enlighten people and to produce a contribution that is not available anywhere else. Not academically, not in the pages of the Fleet Street papers, not in the contents of the broadcast items on the BBC, Sky News, ITV, Channel 4 News, or anywhere else, or on the social media platforms. So I'll continue this in the next edition. This is now coming to 5 minutes past midnight into Wednesday, the 9th of September 2020.